Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This here is an educational channel. We try to check out great theories, discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces that are very explosive in content that you probably have never heard of before. So explosive and obscure, and usually things that people have spent their whole life working on, but you've never heard of it before because it's been suppressed. And this, I believe, is episode 261 of the Bible Decodes. So we've been looking at a lot of these scholars who have spent their whole life on this, putting together an understanding of how to read the New Testament. And we've been in particular looking at a lot of the books that either are full on or are abutting the Roman origins hypothesis, which is that the New Testament, in whole or in part, was written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 to 96 AD. It's Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, and they did this deed for the purposes of psychological warfare against the Jews. They had just gotten done fighting the Jews in a long, 7-year-long war, and they also knew the history that the Jews had been revolting and insurrecting from the Romans for over 100 years, and that they, even though the Romans decimated them in this war from 66 to 73 AD, they really believed that the Jews were going to be resilient and that we're going to come back fighting more. And so they took advantage of the fact that they understood that the Jews were literally waiting for a Messiah as a military commander to help them overthrow the Romans. And so the Caesars instead wrote about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' heavy backpack, turning the other cheek to oppression, and believing that the Roman centurion slave owner was the greatest faith in all of Israel. And at the same time, this Jesus, according to the New Testament, and right in line with what the Romans would have wanted, Jesus is totally deferential to the Romans, but he is always castigating the Jews, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside the center temple, and going after the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the sacrifice at the temple, telling his his Jewish disciples, to abandon their families to follow him. And so Jesus is taking aim at the rituals and practices and folklore of the Jews, which is exactly what the Romans would have wanted, as they were trying to, a lot of the language that they use is kind of from botany. This guy Pedanius, he was a buddy of the Flavians, and he was really known as the first botanist. And they use terms like pruning the Jews, domesticating the Jews, taming the Jews, and they do so in an ultra mean-spirited and degrading and demeaning, ridiculing and mocking of the Jews throughout. But you don't really see that until you kind of know how to break the code. And in order to break the code of the Gospels, you need one extra book, which is from a guy named Josephus, who was a Flavian. He's known as Flavius Josephus, even though he was apparently a Jew who was a military commander for the Jews until he surrendered to General Vespasian and saw that the jig was up and decided that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans. He predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor. And when Vespasian did, he pardoned Josephus, brought him along to Rome, among other places, but eventually to Rome, and made him one of the court historians, put him up at a house in Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. And Josephus, in 7 volumes, writes a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews, where Vespasian and Titus are basically the protagonists, being the generals. Vespasian was the general for the first 3+ years until he becomes the new emperor. And when he becomes the new emperor, he names his son Titus as the military commander, left behind in Jerusalem, Judea, and Titus utterly destroys Jerusalem. And you can see this in this code here. So in the Gospels, Jesus is predicting a lot, prophecy, what's going to happen, and he prophesies that in the amount of time, some of you will still be alive when this happens, and Jerusalem will be torn apart, stone by stone, or something to that effect. And then in the pages of War of the Jews, the Romans do exactly what Jesus predicts that they're going to do, and which you could say, oh, well, Jesus is a great prophet. But the joke is that Jesus says that this destruction of Jerusalem is a marker of his second coming. And the person who fulfills the destruction of Jerusalem is Titus. And so Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And this was recognized by Christians throughout time until the last century or so. The military campaign of Titus serves as a model for the ministry of Jesus. Every place that Titus goes in Judea during this war, as described by Josephus in War of the Jews, Jesus also goes there in the Gospels. And they go to these different locations, 40 or so in all, and they go to these locations in the same order and encounter parallel events at each location. And the parallels add up even more when you look into the book of Luke and see that there are minimum 250 parallels between what's written in the book of Luke and what's written in the War of the Jews. Many of the parallels are unbelievably strong. Some of them are a little bit weak, but you can see the intentionality than what Michael Menescot's in his book Christianity's Origin. He graphs the parallels out on a chart. Took him 4 years to dig out all those parallels. 250 of them in Luke. Luke is only 1,151 verses. So it's more than 1 per 5 verses. And some of them go on verse after verse after verse. So the book of Luke is literally saturated with parallels. And when put on a chart, they make 5 almost perfect letters in the language of the Romans, Latin, APTVS. The T and the V would be presumably about Titus, or if it's a TUS, which they didn't distinguish in Latin, then it would be Titus. Either way, and regardless of the A and the P, who that exactly was, the upshot is that the Romans literally signed their name to the book of Luke. And, you know, when you look at the circumstantial evidence, this was right in the bailiwick of the Romans' MO. They had created other religions for psychological purposes at the same time, including rabbinical Judaism, done under Yohanan ben Zakkai and his land grant that he got from the Flavians to open up a Jewish kind of school or university at Jaffna. And, you know, that was targeted really at a different group of Jews, more like the Pharisees, as opposed to the more zealot flavored Jews for the Gospels. And the Romans really were the only people who had the means and the opportunity to do this, given that they fully controlled censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire. The Gospels are written in the other Roman language of Greek. Josephus is as well. Greek was spoken throughout the Roman Empire, but especially in Rome. The royals would also speak Latin and write in Latin. But in Judea, it was mostly Aramaic. And very few people knew how to write or read, much less write. And the explanatory power of the Roman origins hypothesis is what makes it so powerful, because it is devastating. First, if you look at that chart and you finally yield and say, oh my gosh, the Romans did this, that means that the entire New Testament is fiction. But it also means that Josephus is also fiction. And Josephus is, I believe, like the second best-selling book of all time behind the Bible. And relied upon by ancient historians of all stripes, because it gives unsurpassed information about the first century. And even before the first century. And now, I didn't mention, the Romans, when they wrote the Gospels, they backdated the story by 40 years. And so, that's why we're in, they were writing the stuff in the 70s and 80s and 90s and even later. It didn't just, the New Testament didn't just come out all at once. They put out a new book every 5 years or whatever. And, but all part of the same psychological operation. They first put out Mark and they improved it to get Matthew, and they improved that to get Luke. Luke is the one that fits in with all the graphing and so on. And then I believe Domitian kind of took over in 81 AD, after Titus died, and he kind of took it into a slightly different direction with the book of John and Acts. And then after them, I think Pliny the Younger, famous Roman, literary figure who was a close relative of the Flavians, I think he put together a lot of the Pauline material. But Paul, incidentally, is even more pro-Roman and even more anti-Jew than Jesus is. So he even furthers the Romans' cause even more than Jesus. And that's what we're looking at with the reading today. We're looking at Robert Eisenman's book, which is a compilation of some of his work, from a sample of some of his work, and we're reading a particular chapter that's called Paul as Herodian. The book is called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And Eisenman is one of the kind of the heroes of the Dead Sea Scrolls, saved them from being relegated to the scrap heap of history. These very valuable Jewish, mostly Hebrew and Aramaic documents discovered at Qumran near Jerusalem in the 1940s and 50s, but they depict life mostly in the 1st century AD. And so, given that both Josephus and the Gospels are no longer to be trusted, then the Dead Sea Scrolls fills a void if it can be trusted. And then more on the explanatory power is that when you take away Josephus and you take away Pliny the Younger, you take away Tacitus, who was also in on it, you take away Suetonius and Trajan, Emperor Trajan, then you've taken away all of the evidence of corroborating non-Christian authors who mentioned Jesus. All of them are Roman royals, and so there really is no evidence of Jesus having existed, because it's all taken away by this different paradigm. So that's also very explanatory. Anyway, Eisenman is kind of playing the shell game of names, which it goes on in a lot of ancient literature, but particularly biblical stuff, where you have to different sources give different names for the same person depending on the language and so on, and it's very difficult to figure out who is who. And he's kind of digging into the book of Acts, especially, and the Pauline stuff, and some of these kind of random characters that are in the background of the New Testament are either Herod kings, which are the puppet government that the Romans appointed to rule Judea, more or less, or actual Caesars, Roman royals that sometimes actually hang around with Paul and really serve as a red flag for that Paul is not a normal. This is not rational or reasonable that Jesus and Paul would be so pro-Roman and so anti-Jew. Okay, so we're going to take over right here. Salome's divorce at Herod's insistence to marry the first Helsias, Alexis, one of Herod's close friends and the first in this line of temple treasurers, is paralleled by similar ones by Miriam above and Bernice herself, both of whom are Maccabees, I believe, Hasmoneans, which are, I believe that Herod was also ultimately a Hasmonean. And the Hasmoneans were the Jewish dynasty that defeated the Greek Syrians in the 2nd century BC, and ruled Judea, self-rule, for over 100 years before defeated by Pompey in 63 BC of Rome. Okay, so it's paralleled by similar ones, Miriam above and Bernice herself, from Polemo of Cilicia to take up with Titus. Qumran obviously knew whereof it spoke, in heaping fulsome condemnation on these practices. At least from its perspective and from the one in Revelation, Bernice would almost single-handedly be the whore of Babylon, an expression also incorporating an additional play on the Belial imagery so widespread in the Qumran corpus. It is instructive to contrast such insults with a more accommodating picture of Jesus in Scripture as preferring table fellowship with tax collectors, sinners, and or prostitutes, which in the context delineated above would be symbolic euphemisms for Herodians, or their hangers-on. In Bernice's case, what we have sketched would involve her in a twofold denunciation at Qumran, not to mention her riches and the rumor of her incest with her brother Agrippa II, who was the Herod who was kicked out of Jerusalem when the Jews revolted in 66 AD, causing Emperor Nero to send in Vespasian. Also mentioned by Josephus in relation to her divorce from Polemo. Therefore, in her case, where practices condemned at Qumran are concerned, we have niece marriage, divorce, riches, incest, and finally abandonment of Judaism altogether to take up with Titus. This is Bernice. The destroyer to be of Jerusalem, Emperor Titus. So earlier he really, I think, pinned down the actual people who were involved in this writing of the New Testament. It was Titus, his mistress Bernice, Tiberius Alexander, who was Philo Judaeus's nephew, who was a Hellenized Jew who fought alongside of Titus in this war, and Josephus, who was probably this cousin of Titus named Arius Piso, Josephus being just a pen name. And, you know, obviously when you look at his autobiography and you hear the story about him, you know, predicting Vespasian would be emperor, that's very tall tale there. And there's quite a few tall tales in War of the Jews. You can see that maybe he's presenting a skeleton of the actual events, but he's taking huge liberties with the details. I think it was Arius Piso and his family that really wrote the New Testament. His sons were working with Pliny the Younger, who was his younger brother, Arius Piso, and then foster brother. And then there's one more person involved. It's another Jewish defector. But anyway, these are the group. This is the group who I think was responsible for the New Testament. Okay, so according to the view we are presenting, the burning of the temple at Jerusalem has not a little to do with the burning of her palace, Bernice's, and that of her brother earlier by the insurgents. That's Agrippa II, and in 66 AD. And she and her brother no doubt played a role in urging Titus at the end to destroy it. Paul too shows his knowledge of these kinds of divorces in discussing James's Jerusalem Council directives, in particular fornication, in 1 Corinthians 7:9, but does not condemn them as fulsomely as at Qumran. Rather, he merely slaps the wrist of the offending woman by recommending that she abstain from further marriage, and specifies no additional punitive procedures. It is important to understand that Qumran in general condemns divorce. The disapproval there is linked to the proscription on polygamy and based on references in the Damascus document to male and female. He created them, and 2 by 2 they went into the ark, both citations from Genesis. Where the ruler is concerned, it is combined in good Deuteronomic style not only with not multiplying wives, but in the Temple Scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the proscription on putting a foreigner over you, and the additional ban on marrying foreigners, all with important consequences in respect of Herodians, as should be clear from what we have already described. At the end of the Temple Scroll, these matters are developed more fully and introduce the proscription on marriage with nieces. In many of the above examples where a direct correspondence can be adduced regarding Herodian behavior norms, niece marriage forms an integral part of the problem. Herodias marries not one but two uncles, while at the same time incurring condemnation for divorce at least once. And that would be by John the Baptist in, I think it's in the book of Luke. New Testament speculation notwithstanding, levitate marriage probably had nothing to do with problems relating to her, though she did marry two half-brothers by Herod's two high priestly and therefore demonstrably Jewish wives, Miriam the first and Miriam the second. However this may be, it is not Philip whom Herodias divorces, as we saw, but another uncle named Herod. Not only is Paul's pro-Roman and by extension pro-Herodian political philosophy clear from the general tenor of his missionary activities in Acts, it is made explicit in the enunciation of this philosophy in material like that found in Romans 13:1. A more anti-zealot passage could not be imagined. Setting forth what can only be thought of as deliberate contradiction of the zealot political position on almost every point, including the tax question, obeying overseas rulers, armed resistance, etc., it is also anti-Jamesian, James the brother of Jesus, meaning, for example, good works have nothing to fear from magistrates. It's in James 13:4. James 2:6 states the exact opposite position. Is it not the rich who are always dragging you before the courts? Certainly, quote, good works taken in their Palestinian sense, meaning works of the Torah, could have quite a lot to fear from magistrates, as even the crucifixion of Jesus would have demonstrated. And the good works being alluded to here would appear to be more those sensible in a Greco-Roman sphere. But Paul even goes beyond that here, going on in Romans 13:8 to, quote, in support of such good works, and in particular paying your taxes to Rome, the all-important, all-righteousness commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, which James 2:8 calls the royal law according to the scripture. Acts portrays Paul as speaking felicitously in Caesarea on several occasions at some length with many of the above dramatis personae, Bernice, Agrippa I, and Drusilla, who their sister, identified in Acts 24:24, somewhat tendentiously, also as we saw, as simply a Jewess, with no mention of her relationship to Bernice and Agrippa, and her husband, the infamous Felix the procurator, who were his additional contacts in Rome, is not treated by our documents. At one point, Paul is pictured as saying to Agrippa, in the presence of the great fornicator and future apostate Bernice, I know that you believe. King Agrippa, nothing loath, replies, quote, a little more and you would have made me a Christian. Then Agrippa good-naturedly pronounces the judgment in Acts 26:27, which via the miracle of art has been retrospectively assimilated into the portrait of Herod and Pilate in the Gospels. This man has done nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. it is not very likely that Paul could have made the miraculous escapes he does without the involvement of some combination of these powerful Herodian/Roman forces. Nothing less is conceivable under the circumstances of the attack on Paul in the temple and his rescue by Roman soldiers witnessing these events from the fortress of Antonia. This episode, too, makes mention of a nephew and possibly a sister of Paul, identities otherwise unknown, resident in Jerusalem, but also presumably possessed of Roman citizenship. According to the above dramatis personae related to Josephus's Saulus, they could very well be Julius Archelaus, whom Josephus mentions as one of the avid readers of his Antiquities later in Rome, and that's the later 20-volume work that Josephus wrote in the 90s. He wrote War of the Jews in the 70s, mid-70s. And Julius Archelaus, mother of Cypros, mentioned above, and Saulus, his probable sister, married to the temple treasurer Helcias, or Alexis. Whatever one may finally conclude about these relationships, it is they who warn him of a plot by Nazarite zealots of some kind who have taken an oath not to eat or drink. Therefore, a Nazarite-style oath to abstain from eating and drinking until they have killed Paul. That's in Acts 23:10. Without this kind of intervention, Paul could never have enjoyed the comfortable protective custody he does in Caesarea, where he stays under restraint or otherwise in Agrippa II's palace in Acts 23:35. Nor could he have been packed off in relative security to Rome, where Felix and Drusilla preceded his arrival. Felix, it should be remarked, was the brother of Nero's favorite freedman, Pallas. Paul had arrived in Jerusalem in the first place with funds gathered overseas from many of the areas into which these same Herodians expanded, where circumcision had become such an issue, partly because of the marital practices of Herodian princesses. In fact, it could even be theorized that Paul stopped earlier at Philip's house in Caesarea in Acts 21:8. The evangelists, or the strategos, to lay the groundwork for precisely such an intervention, having been warned in advance of the danger